This session deals with Romans chapter 8 and verses 5 to 17. It's important to note that in verses 5 to 9, Paul is showing us the difference between someone whose source of life is in the Spirit and someone whose source of life is in the flesh. He's not in these verses encouraging us or commanding us to live in a certain way. He's describing the way of life of two different sets of people, those who are in the flesh and those who are in the Spirit, and he draws out some very clear distinctions. If we miss this important distinction, we'll end up thinking that Paul is saying you need to live in a certain way in order to be sure of your salvation. And that's entirely opposite to all that Paul has been saying up to this point and how he'll conclude in the final chapter, the final verses of chapter 8. So what are these distinctions? Setting your mind on things of the flesh leads to death. Setting your mind on things of the Spirit leads to life and peace. The mind is set on the flesh. It's hostile to God. It doesn't submit to God's law. It can't do that. And Paul concludes in verse 8 that those who are in the flesh cannot please God. But, says Paul in verse 9, you believers in Rome are not in the flesh, but in the Spirit. To be in the Spirit is not defined by how you live your life, but by who lives in your life. To be in the Spirit as opposed to be in the flesh depends on whether or not the Holy Spirit lives in you. If you don't have the Spirit of Christ, you don't belong to him. Paul then goes on in verse 10 to say that although the physical body is destined to die because of the damage sin has caused, nevertheless, because of the Spirit of God in you, your final destiny is life, not death. This outcome, Paul says, is because of righteousness. Not the righteousness of the believer, but the righteousness of Christ. In particular, the one righteous act of obedience when he died in our place to give us the life in his Spirit. And if the Spirit of God is in us, then God will raise us up also, as he did with Jesus. The meaning of this verse 11, refers to the final resurrection in the future. If the Spirit of God is in us, then God will raise us up also, as he did with Jesus. But it also applies to life here and now. God gives life now to our mortal body, not only energy to live beyond our natural and normal limitations, but also in the healing of our bodies in the face of sickness. In the life to come, there'll be no need for healing because we'll all live with resurrection bodies that will never suffer from sickness. But we can experience glimpses of that future, the powers of the age to come, in the healing of our bodies in this present life. Verse 12 tells us that as a result of the previous teaching on where the source of our life comes from, we as believers have no obligation, no outstanding debt that the flesh might require of us. Now, I think it's important to note that Paul makes a distinction between the words walk and live. Living has to do with where the source of our life comes from. Walking has to do with the manner in which we behave. And Paul makes this distinction very clear in Galatians 5 and 25. He says, if we live in the Spirit, let us also walk in the Spirit. So Paul is saying here in verse 13 that if the source of our life is the flesh, then it'll lead to death. He's referring to those who are outside of Christ. I don't think he's warning us as Christians that fleshly behavior in a Christian will lead to damnation. He then describes the way in which a Christian lives. They are the ones who put to death the deeds of the body. In other words, if you're a person who puts to death the deeds of the body, it's a sign that you have the life of God. And the next verse says the same thing. Those who are led by the Spirit of God are sons of God. Does this mean only those who get guidance from God? No, this is not talking about guidance. It's talking about those who are led by the Spirit of God to put the deeds of the body to death. One of the signs that you're a child of God is that you put to death the deeds of the body. Yeah, but what does putting to death the deeds of the body mean? Well, let me quote again from my comments on Romans 6 and 13. You don't use your hands to hit people. You don't use your legs to go somewhere you shouldn't. You don't lend your ears to listen to gossip. You don't use your mouth to criticize other people. You don't look at things that you shouldn't. You don't allow your mind to dwell on sinful thoughts. You say no to them when they come to mind. So verse 15, what is the nature of the spirit within us? It's not a spirit of slavery, says Paul. You see, the fear of punishment governs the slave. He must please the master all the time, do what he says. And the law dominated the life of the Israelite. To deliberately disobey meant death. They were in fear of doing the wrong thing and suffering the consequences. Fear of punishment can keep behavior under control, but it never captures your heart. The spirit we have received doesn't create fear, it's a spirit of adoption. Now, adoption for the Roman citizen was when someone who wasn't by birth a member of a family was given the right to be called a son through an adoption ceremony. And we've been adopted into the family of God. We didn't belong there by right, but we've been given that right. We're now sons of God. We have the Spirit of God as a sign to us of that position, and upon our resurrection, we'll be given the full measure of that relationship as sons of God. This is a massive clue to us as we face the various situations in life and possible answers in difficulties. We've not received a spirit of fear leading to slavery again. Does the situation I face cause fear, despair, hopelessness? If it does, this is not the Spirit of God, but a spirit of fear. Don't respond to the situation out of fear. You received the spirit of sonship. God is your Father. Abba is the Aramaic word for Father. Don't react to a situation out of fear. Remind yourself that you're a child of God and look for the response of faith, of trust in God, and that He has all situations in His hand. Verse 16 says that the Spirit of God speaks to our spirit and assures us that we're God's children. Knowing is not a matter of the mind, but of the Spirit. Deep in our hearts, God's Spirit says to us that we're children of God. Finally, in verse 17, Paul adds the end result of being a son of God, that we will be heirs. We will have an inheritance. But the pathway to that inheritance follows the pattern of how Jesus obtained his inheritance, and that is through suffering. Glory comes through suffering. In 2 Timothy 3 and 12, it says that anyone who lives a godly life will suffer persecution. It's to be expected. It's not an unusual thing. Peter, when he writes to his fellow Jews, says, don't regard trials as an unusual thing. People will speak against you. You will be misunderstood. People will leave you out of their company. You may even suffer physical violence. Suffering is the pathway to glory as part and parcel of being a joint heir with Christ. Next time, we'll pick up from here and contrast the suffering experienced in this age, or this period of time, with the glory of the age to come.